I'd like to welcome in now Democratic strategist David Carlucci and Republican strategist and former Republican candidate for U.S. Senate in New Jersey, Alex Zdan. Alex and David, thank you so much for giving us some of your time today. Alex, I want to start with you, and I want to talk about this dismantling of the education department. The president is set to sign that executive order later today. Let's listen to some of what he said.
We have a dream, and you know what the dream is? We're going to move the Department of Education. We're going to move education into the states so that the states, instead of bureaucrats working in Washington, so that the states can run education.
All right, so as we've said, Alex, they've already cut the department by about 50% with these layoffs. Is this symbolic when it comes to this executive order, or what is actually happening with this?
Donald Trump means what he says. He means what he campaigned on, and he means what Republicans have meant for decades when they've talked about dismantling the Department of Education. And this president is actually going to do it with Congress's help. The Department of Education was not established as its own entity until 1979. From 1953 to 1979, the functions of health, education, and the welfare programs in this country were consolidated under one department. I would like to ask Democrats if they believe that the only way to have great education in this country is to have a separate Department of Education, because if you look at the data, our schools during that period of time were pretty good. America led the world during that period of time. We need to compete with the Chinese Communist Party, which is intensifying its educational activities with its population. America needs to compete in an increasingly complex world that has a reliance on technology. We need the best schools on the planet. The Department of Education has been standing in the way of that. That obstacle is going to be removed, and education is going to be dealt with at the state and local level, which is where it belongs.
Well, I want to ask a follow-up to that, Alex, because many of these states are already dealing with struggling to balance their budgets. If now their responsibility is on the states, are things going to get better?
Well, certainly what we're saying here is if we're dismantling the federal workforce that works at the Department of Education, the federal government is not going to step out of assisting local districts and states with their educational activities. That block grant idea that was mentioned in the first Trump administration, still very active. There are plenty of ways the federal government can help schools without onerous bureaucracy.
All right. Well, so David, over to you and the other side of things. We know that there are protests popping up all over the country. Lots of teachers are concerned that students will really pay the ultimate price here. The Education Secretary, Linda McMahon, told News Nation, though, that this day was coming. I'd like to play part of what she said.
The president campaigned on this. He's been crystal clear that he wants to see the Department of Education closed, and he'd like to see it done sooner rather than later. But he understands that we need to work with Congress. There are certain things that are in statute. It would take 60 votes in the Senate to close the Department of Education. And I think my job is to convince Congress that the steps that we are taking are in the best interest of the kids.
All right, so David, to you, I'd like your thoughts on this. You know, we heard Alex make reference to these test scores, which, you know, arguably are not the best here. Do you think this will make things better?
Well, no, I don't think it'll make things better. And I think that's why a lot of people are very concerned right now. This uncertainty. We talk about trying to make education better, but yet we're not. This is all about cutting funding to education, absolving the federal government of the responsibility that we should all take part in making sure our children have the best education possible. And this is a step backwards. This is not a step forward. We're taking away the complement that the Department of Education adds to education departments across the country, to school districts across the country. Now we're saying you're on your own. We understand there are problems, but you and you alone will fix it. If there were these plans in terms of how we're going to bolster education in the United States, why isn't the president talking about that? Instead, the president is complaining and nitpicking programs that I think he's even confusing from the local level to the federal level. And it looks like our White House needs to be educated in terms of how our government works. You heard the secretary just talk about the process, and then you have the president coming forward with an executive order that cannot absolve the Department of Education. And we see this time and time again, where the White House is trying to just take and see if they'll be reprimanded and if the laws will actually be followed. This is a real problem, and you see a pattern of this, not just with the Department of Education, but time and time again in these past few months where the president has just overreached, and anyone that stands up and points out the actual laws or the Constitution is somehow wrong and even should be kicked out of government or lose their jobs. That's the rhetoric we hear from the White House. I would love to see some solid plans. And if the goal is to improve our children's education, how are you going to do it?
Yeah, that's certainly a valid question. We'll see how that plays out. Alex, I want to get to these deportation flights and the showdown that we've really seen all week. We know the president is kind of escalating attacks on this federal judge, calling for him to be impeached. The administration has insisted that these were all criminals, the worst of the worst, that they deported gang members, but has yet to actually provide the proof, which is some of what the court is asking. What is your reaction to what we're seeing play out right now?
I think it's pretty typical. It's about what we expected. The federal judiciary and the Democratic Party are going to be reaching out to try and impede the president from doing what he is allowed to do under the statute and under the Constitution. If you're talking about these specific flights that are under question here, once they left American soil, the judge's order did not apply. So this is something that we can debate back and forth on. The nitty-gritty of it is literally going to come down to when these planes' wheels left the earth. But I think that this is a broader sense of the president taking every measure at his disposal in order to combat the crime of violent offenders who happen to be illegal migrants and making sure to get them out of the country, making good on his promise to do exactly that, which is what the people voted for back in November.
I know, and David, something tells me you will disagree, but the White House press secretary basically says that the judges are, quote, trying to dictate policy from the president of the United States, saying that they are trying to, slow walk this agenda. But on the other side of things, Minority Leader Chuck Schumer is saying that our country is at risk because the president is violating the laws. Again, Schumer, that's another subject, but how do you think this moves forward, David?
Well, I think this is a big problem because, yes, we all want violent gang members removed from our country. There's no question about that. However, we also want to respect due process. And we need to balance both of these issues. And what Donald Trump is doing here is ignoring the judicial branch of government. And the fact that my friend here says that as soon as these planes took off, the judge loses all control. I mean, think about that for a second. If that's the precedent that we set, we are in very serious trouble, because that means that all rules that we care about are out the window the minute a plane takes off and leaves the ground. I mean, this is absurd. And this is the problem, that we're trying to twist something that, oh, you don't want gang members, violent gang members removed from our communities? Of course we do. But we also need to respect the rule of law and due process. That's what our nation is about. And if you don't like that, then we need to figure out a way to make it more expedient and make sure that justice is served. But this is not justice. When anybody can be picked off the street and you associate them to a gang, this is a slippery slope. We've seen this done in other countries. And I think we should be very concerned about this and not attack it and a red herring to say that we don't want these violent criminals removed. I mean, that is absurd. The problem is due process, and we don't want anyone off the street to be picked up and removed or deported and then have no recourse because, oops, oh, the plane took off already. Sorry, too late. I mean, this is just a bridge too far, and we need to bring it back and recognize we are a nation of laws. We have the separation of government, checks and balances, and we need to revisit that course in history if we've missed it. That's history, and that's politics.
Well, we're running out of time here. I want to make
101.
sure that I can get this question and give you both just a chance to answer quickly. We know the economy is the #1 issue for Americans. We learned yesterday the inflation rate, the interest rate would remain the same. But we also know that these reciprocal tariffs are set to go into place April 2nd. Based on what we've seen with the markets, the turmoil, there's been some bounce back. I want to ask both of you, Alex, do you think that President Trump does move forward with these reciprocal tariffs April 2nd?
In a word, yes. In more than one word, yes, but there will be carve-outs and caveats as there are in every tariff that has always been issued from this administration and other administrations getting caveats and carve-outs for tariffs is a cottage industry in Washington. And by the way, what I'm going to do after this is buy my friend David a ticket to a cruise so he can experience the idea of international waters, because there are places outside the United States where American law does not hold sway.
And David, just 15 seconds. Do you think that those reciprocal tariffs do in fact happen?
Oh, absolutely. You have nations around the world, our allies as well as our enemies, all enter into a trade war and now have said they're going to go a step further. Just listen to the politicians in Canada, our friends, that say they need to wreak havoc and harm on Americans because of Donald Trump's actions. So this is a trade war that will benefit no one. And I'm still scratching my head trying to understand it. And so are economists, because they're saying this will lead to a recession.
Yeah. Well, we will certainly see. David Carlucci, Alex Zdan, thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Great to be with you. Looking forward to that cruise.
Bon voyage.
Lawmakers hosting town halls around